When you're just starting out in your filmmaking career, it can be overwhelming to try and figure out all the bits of equipment you need to start shooting. It feels like there's constantly a new drone or camera coming out every few weeks, and it can be easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you'd finally be able to start working on your next film or documentary if only you had an FX3 or a C300. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. In documentary, the only thing that really matters is story, and the gear is just a tool to help tell it. But of all the hype out there on YouTube, there are a few things that are talked about way too much and are totally not essential for documentary filmmakers, especially when you're starting out. So in this video, I'm gonna get into 5 of the things I think you should skip so you can save your money for the things that matter. Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Luke Forsyth, and on this channel, I teach the skills I've learned over 10 years working as a documentary filmmaker and photographer. If that's the kind of thing you're into, consider subscribing because there's going to be new videos every Wednesday. A few weeks ago, I made a video about the 5 things filmmakers really need to get started, and it was pretty simple stuff. You need a camera with a kit lens, some basic audio gear, and a tripod. Those are the fundamentals of doc filmmaking, and with the right story and some commitment, you can make an incredible documentary with just 5 items. But it seems like everywhere I look on YouTube, there are videos telling you about the latest and greatest pieces of tech that you need right now or your work is garbage. There are some great channels out there that don't do this, but I feel like gear is just shoved down our throat to the point where it's easy to get caught up in the feeling that you just need to keep buying stuff. Not only is this bad for the environment, but it's also going to take up valuable cash that you could be spending on a production budget or hiring a crew or paying an editor. Now I'm just going to say that none of these things I'm going to talk about today are actually bad in any way. In fact, a lot of them are useful tools that can help up your production value in the right situation, but that's all they are. Tools. Story is king. And if one of these things adds to your story, then by all means, ignore me and get it. But if you're just starting out or don't have unlimited cash to spend, these 5 things aren't worth getting hung up on, in my opinion. Okay, now that I got that out of the way, what's the first thing? I wanted to start with one I think I'll probably get the most flack for because it seems like every YouTuber out there is shooting with them, and why not get the pain over with? Gimbals. There, I said it. I think they're overrated and totally not necessary to own, especially if you're a doc filmmaker. I've managed to make it 10 years of shooting some pretty high-end stuff without ever owning one, and no one has complained. At least not that I know of. For me, gimbals just aren't worth the sunk cost of how much time it takes to get them set up and then taking your camera on and off them constantly. When I shoot docs, I regularly shoot hours and hours of footage every day, and if you've ever tried holding a Ronin with a camera on it for even 15 minutes, you'll know that it gets painful fast. I can't imagine shooting even an hour like that, let alone a full day, and while you're constantly getting your camera on and off it, you're missing stuff that's happening all around you. On top of that, I personally think that docs are supposed to look a little bit raw sometimes. One of my favorite docs ever is Cartel Land, and a lot of the most powerful scenes in there are moving all over the place. Movement can add to the feeling and intensity of your project, and as long as it's organic looking, meaning not shaky micro jitters, I love the way it looks. Now from time to time there might be a scene where this isn't true, like maybe you're following a professional runner and without stabilization the whole movie will be bouncing all over the place and be unwatchable. Or maybe you're filming a car-to-car on a bumpy road. There are definitely times when gimbals are useful, and in that case, rent one. That's what I do, and it hasn't been a problem so far. I'm just gonna say this one last time and then stop for the rest of the video. If you need a gimbal, get a gimbal. But if you're building up a new kit or trying to decide between buying one and paying for gas to travel to a location to shoot, don't pick the gimbal. And if you think I'm dead wrong, feel free to let me know in the comments. Something else that seems to have come out of nowhere and now is suddenly one of the main benchmarks people use when judging whether or not a camera is good or not is autofocus. Up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, autofocus was so bad that it was pretty much unusable for professional work. These days on high-end cameras it seems to work pretty well, and everyone is comparing how many milliseconds faster the FX3 is than the R6 or whatever, and if a camera doesn't have the very best autofocus, it's a deal breaker for some people. This is the next thing that I'd say to stop worrying so much about, because it might be nice to have in some situations, but it's definitely not a need to have. For starters, when I'm filming a scene, I don't want the camera to have any say where the focus is. It can get confused by fast-moving subjects that change shape or when someone's face disappears behind a bush or something, and then start hunting. In documentaries, if you miss an important moment, that's it for the most part. And if the autofocus gets confused at the wrong time, you're screwed. Audiences will watch footage that's out of focus or sit through the moments where the camera operator is clearly trying to get there, and I think it can actually add to the emotion of a scene and make people feel like they're really there. But when the camera is trying to find autofocus, it's not organic at all, and it is clearly a machine hunting for a reference point. There's nothing emotional about that look, and you're probably not going to want to use any shots where it happens. And trust me, the laws of filmmaking dictate that things like that will always happen at the worst possible moment. Now, if you get a decent camera with good autofocus, it can be super handy, especially for filming interviews where you can lock it onto the subject's eye and then just trust it to stay there. Now that I have the ability to use autofocus, it lets me think more about the questions I'm asking, and in that way, I'm glad I have it. But I didn't have it for pretty much my entire career, and it didn't hurt me. In fact, the Fujinon Cine lenses I use on my FX9 when I'm doing big jobs for Netflix or National Geographic or wherever, they don't even have the ability to autofocus. They're fully manual and have no electronics at all. So when you're looking for a new camera and you go down one of those YouTube rabbit holes of gear reviews, if you hear someone saying that this is a great camera but the autofocus isn't amazing, don't let that be a deal breaker. You might find it handy in some specific situations, but you absolutely do not need it. Moving on, the next thing I'd say is also a bit overblown when it comes to shooting documentaries are full frame sensors. Hold on, I can already hear people calling for my head out there. But the truth is that no one, not even Hollywood, had access to good full-frame video cameras until very recently. And even though Arri and other big cinema brands are starting to put out full-frame stuff, a ton of big-budget movies are still shot on Super 35 cameras, and they look amazing. Full transparency here, both of the cameras that I own are full-frame capable, but that's just because it's the default for professional cameras these days, not because it was a requirement for me. A good lens is going to make a way bigger difference to your image quality than the size of your sensor, and I actually shoot my FX9 in Super 35 mode most of the time just so I can use my Fujinon lenses that are crop sensor only. Shooting at Super 35 will open up a ton of extra lens options like the Sigma 18-35 and 50-100 1.8, as well as some amazing cinema glass like Cooke S4s that just won't work on your full frame camera. Again, not saying that full frame isn't nice, but if you've got a solid story and take the time to frame nice shots, no one is going to have any idea how big your sensor was. So when you're starting out, keep your eye out for good deals on Super 35mm cameras that might be a bit cheaper than the full frame ones. No one will be able to tell, believe me. Another thing that seems to get talked about a lot when a new camera is coming out is whether or not it's going to be able to output to an external recorder for maximum quality raw footage or the absolute deepest color depth and blah blah blah. I can see that if you were shooting a commercial or maybe a crazy music video or something, it would be appealing to be able to get the best possible image for editors and graders to deal with, but for making documentaries, these things, at least in my opinion, are totally not necessary. In fact, in my opinion, I'd almost say that having footage that high quality could be a bad thing because of the sheer amount of hard drive space it takes up. Unlike commercials or movies, documentaries have crazy high shooting ratios. The shooting ratio basically refers to the amount of footage shot versus the amount of screen time, so a 2-to-1 shooting ratio means that for every 2 minutes of footage, 1 minute gets used in the final project. A documentary could easily have a shooting ratio of 100-to-1 or higher. You need to film so much for docs because you never know what you'll need later, and if you're shooting ProRes RAW at 5 GB a minute or whatever, that amount of data is going to be total nightmare to deal with. Not only will you need to buy expensive SSDs to go into the recorders, but you're also going to need huge fast hard drives to store it all and edit from. Even Last Chance U, which is one of my favorite doc series of all time, doesn't shoot raw footage all the time, even though it's a big Netflix show. I was actually reading an interview with the DP where he said they shot raw for some of their B-roll, but the show couldn't handle the financial burden of shooting raw all the time, so they had to be selective. That's a big show with multiple camera teams and dedicated editors, and if they don't want to deal with raw, then I'd say you might not want to either. Hopefully that's going to get easier and easier with new codecs coming out, and maybe one day soon we'll all be able to shoot raw footage for docs without all the headaches, but for now, I'd say to skip it unless you know you need it. Remember when there was that huge scandal a while back when the Canon R5 kept overheating at 8K filming and the internet was freaking out? Yeah, that whole time I just remember seeing the reviews and thinking, I couldn't care less about 8K. Resolution has always been a weird one with cameras, and a lot of people think having a higher resolution will automatically make their footage look better. I'll admit that I wouldn't want to watch a movie shot in 640p these days, but to me it seems like we've gotten diminishing returns after 1080, and for documentaries, I don't think an ultra high-res sensor matters that much at all. In fact, 8K sensors might even be a negative thing for me if I didn't have the option to shoot lower resolutions as well. I'm actually not even fully convinced that 4K is better than 1080, and a lot of the time when I'm watching 4K TVs, things look too real for me. Suddenly I can see that I'm looking at an actor wearing makeup, and when I'm trying to get lost in a good story, I don't always want to see every pore on the main character's face. I can see why super high res might be great for sports or nature docs and the space telescope, but for me, making stories about real people, I'm not totally sold. I actually shot an hour-long doc for Vice last year and it was only 1080. If 4K wasn't a requirement for making shows Netflix compatible these days, I'm not even sure I'd shoot 4K all the time. I've managed to come to terms with 4K and I even shoot these YouTube videos in 4K, so I'm not totally stuck in the past. But before you make 8K recording a main priority for your next camera purchase, I'd ask yourself why. If you make Apple commercials or have really low shooting ratios on your projects, then it could make sense. But for me, making documentaries, I don't see much need to go above 4K just yet. That's it. Those are the 5 things that I think are overrated when it comes to documentary filmmaking. I'm curious to know if anyone out there strongly disagrees with those things, and if so, why? Let me know in the comments. Hope that video was helpful and that I might have even saved you a bit of money on a piece of gear that you can now use to actually get out there and shoot something. If you got something out of that and want to see more, hit that subscribe button because there's new videos coming out every week. And if you like that one, you might also like this one about 5 things you actually need to get started on your first doc. See ya!